Hello, this is Morel Bernard with the life story of an American, and the American is Booker T. Washington. Yes, Booker T. Washington. The worth of work with the hands as an uplifting power in real education was first brought home to me with striking emphasis when I was a student at the Hampton Normal and Agriculture Institute, which was at that time under the direction of the late General S.C. Armstrong. But I recall with interest and experience earlier than my Hampton training, along similar lines of enlightenment which came to me when I was a child. Soon after I was made free by the proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, there came the new opportunity to attend a public school at my hometown in West Virginia. When the teacher said that the chief purpose of education was to enable one to speak and write the English language correctly, the statement found lodgment in my mind and stayed there. While at the time I could not put my thoughts into words clearly enough to express instinctive disagreement with my teacher, this definition did not seem adequate. It grated harshly upon my young ears, and I had reasons for feeling that education ought to do more for a boy than merely to teach him to read and write. While the scheme of education was being held up before me, my mother was living in abject poverty, lacking the commonest necessaries of life, and working day and night to give me a chance to go to school for 2 or 3 months of the year. And my foremost aim in going to school was to learn ways and means by which I might make life more endurable, and if possible, even attractive for my dear mother. There were several boys of our neighborhood who had superior school advantages and who were, in more than one instant, they had reached the point where they were called educated, which meant that they could write and talk correctly. But their parents were not far removed from the conditions in which my mother was living, and I could not help wondering whether this kind of education alone was fitted to help me in the immediate needs of relieving the hard times at home. This idea, however, ran counter to the current of widespread opinion among my people. Young as I was, I had come to have the feeling that to be a free boy meant, to a considerable extent, freedom from work with the hands, and that this new status applied especially to the educated boy. Just after the Civil War, the Negro lad was strongly influenced by two beliefs. One, that freedom from slavery brought with it freedom from hard work. The other, that education of the head would bring even more sweeping emancipation from work with the hands. It is fair to add that the Negro was not directly responsible for either of these ideas, but they warped his views nevertheless and held sway over the masses of the young generation. I had felt and observed these things, and further, as a child in Virginia, had naturally noted that young white boys whose fathers held slaves did not often work with their hands. Not long after I had begun to think of these new conditions and their results, viewing them as seriously as could be expected of an ignorant boy, an event of my working life left important influences in its wake. There lived, a little way from my mother's cabin, a woman of wealth, who had lived many years in the South, although she had been born and educated in Vermont. She had a high respect for manual labor showing actively her appreciation of the dignity of honest work well done, and notwithstanding her own position and culture, she was not ashamed to use her hands. In the neighborhood, this lady was reputed to be exceedingly hard to please in the performance of any sort of work on her place. And among the village boys, she was called a hard person to get along with. As I remember, at least half a dozen boys had been successively chosen to live with her, but their residence in service had been consistently short-lived. I think a week was about the average period, in spite of the widely advertised fact that the household had the redeeming reputation of always providing good things to eat. In addition to pies and cakes, which boys in a community like ours seldom saw in their own cabin homes. The orchards around the house bore heavy yields of the finest fruits. Yet such extraordinary inducements as these could not hold the boys, who one by one returned to the village with the same story, that the lady of the mansion was too strict and too hard to please. After a long record of these mutual disappointments, my mother told me that my turn had come, as the rich and exacting personage had sent to ask me to come and live with her, with a promise of $5 a month in wages. After a long and serious talk with my mother, I decided to make the effort to serve this woman, although the tidings of so many failures filled me with foreboding. A few days later, with my clothes made as presentable as possible, and with my heart thumping in fear and anxiety, I reported for duty. I had heard so much about Mrs. Ruffner, her wealth, her fine house, and her luxurious surroundings, overshadowed by her appalling severity and exacting discipline, that I trembled with a terror which I shall not try to describe at the thought of facing her. My life had been lived in a cabin, and I was now to try to toil in what looked to me like a grand mansion, an enchanted place filled with alarms. But I got a grip on all the courage in my scanty stock, and braced myself to endure the ordeal with all possible fortitude. The meeting was not at all what I had expected. Mrs. Ruffner talked to me in the kindest way, and her frank and positive manner was tempered with a rehearsal of the difficulties encountered with the boys who had preceded me, how and why they had failed to please, and what was expected of them and of me. I saw that it would be my fault if I failed to understand my duties, as she explained them in detail. I would be expected to keep my body clean and my clothes clean, and cleanliness was to be the motto in all my work. She said that all things could be done best by system, and she expected it of me, and that the exact truth at all times, regardless of consequences, was one of the first laws of her household, a law whose violation could never be overlooked. I remember too that she placed special emphasis upon the law of promptness, and said that excuses and explanations could never be taken in the place of results. At the time, this seemed to me a pretty STEM program to live up to, and I was fighting a sense of discouragement when, toward the end of the interview, She told me that if I were able to please her, she would permit me to attend school at night during the winter. Well, this suggestion so stimulated my ambition that it went a long way toward clinching the decision to make the effort of my life to satisfy my employer and to break all records for length of service in her household. My first task, as I remember it, was to cut the grass around the house and then to give the grounds a thorough cleaning up. In those days, there were no lawn mowers, and I had to go down on my knees and cut much of the grass with a little hand cinch. I soon found that my employer not only wished the grass cut, but also demanded that it be trimmed smooth and even. Anyone who has tried to mow a lawn with a dull hand cinch or sickle can realize the difficulties which beset this labor. I am not ashamed to say that I did not succeed in giving satisfaction the first, or even the second or third time. But at last I made the turf in that yard look as smooth and velvety as if I had been over it with the most improved pattern of lawnmower. With this achievement, my sense of pride and satisfaction began to stir itself and to become a perceptible incentive. I found, however, that cutting the grass was not the whole task. Every weed, tuft of dead grass, bit of paper, or scrap of dirt of any kind must be removed. Nor did I succeed at the first attempt in pleasing my employer. Many times, when tired and hot with trying to put this yard in order, I was heartsick and discouraged and almost determined to run away and go home to my mother. But I kept at it. And after a few days, as the result of my efforts under the strict oversight of my mistress, we could take pleasure in looking upon a yard where the grass was green and almost perfect in its smoothness, where the flower beds were trimly kept, the edges of the walks clean cut, and where there was nothing to mar the well-ordered appearance. When I saw and realized that all this was a creation of my own hands, my whole nature began to change. I felt a self-respect, an encouragement, and a satisfaction that I had never before enjoyed or thought possible. Above all else, I had acquired a new confidence in my ability actually to do things and to do them well. And more than this, I found myself through this experience getting rid of the idea, which had gradually become a part of me, that the head meant everything and the hands little in working endeavor, and that only to labor with the mind was honorable, while to toil with the hands was unworthy and even disgraceful. With this vital growth of realization, there came the warm and hearty commendation of the good woman who had given me what I now consider my first chance to get in touch with the real things of life. When I recall this experience, I know that then and there, my mind was awakened and strengthened. As I began to reap satisfaction from the works of my hands, I found myself planning overnight how to gain success in the next day's effort. I would try to picture the yard as I meant it to look when completed, and laid awake nights trying to decide upon the prettiest curves for the flower beds and the proper width of the walks. I was soon far more absorbed in this work than in filling in my leisure time seeking mischief with the village boys. I remained in this family for several years, and the longer I was employed there, the more satisfaction I got out of my work. Instead of fearing the woman whom the other boys had found so formidable, I learned to think of her and to regard her now, for she still lives, as one of my greatest teachers. Later, whether working in the coal mines or at the salt furnaces, I learned to find the same kind of satisfaction in everything I did for a living. If while sweeping or dusting a room or weeding a bed of flowers or vegetables, there remained the least imperfection, I was unhappy and felt that I was guilty of dishonesty until the flaw in my work had been removed. While I have never wished to underestimate the awakening power of purely mental training, I believe that this visible, tangible contact with nature gave me inspirations and ambitions which could not have come in any other way. I favor the most thorough mental training and the highest development of mind. But I want to see these linked with the common things of the universal life about our doors. It was this experience in using my hands that led me, in spite of all the difficulties in the way, to go to the Hampton Institute, where I had learned that pupils could have not only their minds educated, but their hands trained. When I entered the Hampton Institute, few industries were taught there, but these had to do with the fundamentals of everyday life. The handwork began with the duties which lay directly in the path of the student. We were taught to make our own beds, to clean our rooms, to take care of the recitation rooms, and to keep the grounds in order. Then came lessons in raising our food on the farm and the proper methods of cooking and serving it in the school. The instruction in iron and woodwork in the earlier years of the institution was mostly in making and repairing the farming implements and in helping to maintain the buildings. While much of this work may seem rudimentary, it had great educational value. How well I remember the feeling of stimulus and satisfaction inspired by the sight of a perfectly made bed, the pillars placed always at the right angle and the edges of the sheets turned over according to rules of neatness and system. The work of the farm had a similar kind of influence upon my views of relative values in education. I soon learned that there was a great difference between studying about things and studying the things themselves, between book instruction and the illumination of practical experience. This chain of experiences, whose links I've tried to indicate, served as a preparation for the work of training the head, the heart, and the hands, which I was to undertake later at the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in Alabama. When I went to Alabama to begin this work, I spent some time in visiting towns and country districts in order to learn the real conditions and needs of the people. It was my ambition to make the little school which I was about to found a real service in enriching the life of the most lowly and unfortunate. With this end in view, I not only visited the schools, churches, and farms of the people, but slept in their one-room cabins and ate at their tables at their fare of cornbread and fried pork. Often while making these visits, both in the towns and in the plantation districts, I found young men and women who had acquired considerable education, but it seemed to be limited to memorizing certain rules in grammar and arithmetic. Some of them had studied both the classic and modern languages, and I discovered students who could solve problems in arithmetic and algebra which I could not master. Yet, I could not escape the conviction that the more abstract these problems were, and the further they were removed from the life the people were living or were to live, the more stress seemed to be placed upon them. One of the saddest features was to find here and there instances of those who had studied what was called art or instrumental music. In other words, the elegant accomplishments, but who were living in houses where there was no sign of beauty or system. There was not the slightest indication that this art or these accomplishments that had or ever would have any influence upon the life and the homes of these people. Indeed, it did not seem to have occurred to them that such things ought to have any relation to their everyday life. I found young men who would wrestle successfully with the toughest problems in compound interest or banking or foreign exchange, but who had never thought of trying to figure out why their fathers lost money on every bale of cotton raised and why they were continually mortgaging their crops and falling deeper into debt. I talked with girls who could locate on the map accurately the Alps and the Andes, but who had no idea of the proper position of the knives and forks on the dinner table. I found those who remember that bananas were grown in certain South and Central American countries, but to whom it had never occurred that they might be a nourishing and appetizing food for their breakfast tables. In a country where pigs, chicken, ducks, geese, berries, peaches, plums, vegetables, nuts, and other wholesome foods could be produced with little effort, school teachers were eating salt pork from Chicago and canned chicken and tomatoes sent from Omaha, while the countryside abounded in all manner of beautiful shrubbery and fragrant flowers. Few of these ever found their way into the houses or upon the dinner tables, while in many instances the people had always lived in the country and would continue to do so. What few textbooks I saw in their cabins were full of pictures and reading material relating to city life. In these textbooks, I saw pictures of great office buildings, ships, streetcars, warehouses, but not a single picture of a farm scene, a spreading apple tree, a field of grass or corn, a flock of sheep, or a herd of cows. The life of Booker T. Washington, the American. Booker T. Washington, do join me for the next video on the life of Booker T. Washington, the American. Join me then, Morale Bernard. I'll see you then. American Life.